Hello, humanoids, and welcome to episode 12 in our course on the philosophy of climate change. As always, it's Adam and the good Admiral Akbar here to accompany you and guide you on this learning odyssey. This is the first lecture in Module 3, and so this is going to be like Lecture 5 when we started Module 2, which is just going to be an overview of what's to come. So this module I have called Climate Science and Context, or sometimes I call it Theories of Climate Politics. Yeah, I can decide which one was a better term for it, so I use them both. Let's jump into it. What I want to do today is just survey Module 3. Again, Theories of Climate Politics or Climate Science and Context. I'm going to do it with a couple of slides just to put it all in a nutshell. And then I'm going to step way back to look at the way we looked at science from a broad perspective, theory of science. What is it? We're going to look at political theory, which is really theory of the human condition. We're going to look at that at a grand scale, and then we're going to zoom in on the social process. And then we're going to talk about what science can and cannot do. And what it can't do points to perhaps the need for climate philosophy and climate philosophers. Talk about that, and then wrap it up with one slide looking ahead, just overviewing very briefly the lectures in this module. Okay, so in a nutshell, I had you all read this piece by Elizabeth Colbert, the climate expert who delivered news no one wanted to hear, about Jim Hansen. And I wanted you to read this for several reasons, but one, because it seemed like he had a theory of climate politics or climate science politics that led him to believe certain things and then they didn't happen. And we'll talk about this more next time as well. But he was publishing, doing a scientific work, and he thought someone would do something, right? This is a quote from the article. But nobody was doing anything, he thought, or not enough. And so he thought all of his scientific efforts would come to naught if he didn't also involve himself in political action. So here is a person, very important person in the world of climate science and politics, trying to figure out and trying to navigate this relationship between knowing and acting. And that's where I think we need to focus. So I feel like now we're in a position, we have some tools from Module 1 to help us in our thinking, and we have some content, basic climate science content from Module 2. Now we're in a position to put that all together. So we have this science, but of course we know climate change appears in the world of politics, which is where that science has to be understood, has to be digested. It needs to become meaningful and rendered into speech and translated into action. So we need to understand all of this and, of course, how it interacts with each other, right? But more than that, I didn't quite know where to put media. I am increasingly convinced that you can't talk about climate change without having a theory of media, or maybe several theories of media, what's going on. And I put it here because, look, we don't have unmediated access to reality. Science, we saw, is mediated through instruments, through our methodologies. So there's media even at the very heart of science in a certain way. And of course, there's media in the world of politics, and there's media between the two as science gets mediated into the political sphere. All sorts of questions here about who are the gatekeepers of that information. How is it framed? How is it interpreted? So the rhetorical, the hermeneutic, the ethical questions, the political, philosophical questions are there. And then economics, perhaps the emperor over all of this is economics. I mean, I think in the modern world, we understand politics largely as the management of a growing economy. And again, with the Anthropocene, the big question is whether we can keep growing the human economy. Science is in the service of economics, economic growth through the development of technological innovation. And of course, you need economic infrastructure to sustain the scientific enterprise. So all of this is interrelated, and I put this dopey little spherical sort of space here. And I said, this is the space we're trying to map and understand in module 3. So what are these relationships? How can we understand them? What should they look like? So that's it in a nutshell. That's what we're doing. In your notes for this lecture, I have a couple of books listed there. One is by Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition. What I'm going to say comes pretty much straight out of that. I think she was simply the best political thinker of the 20th century. I could say more about her, but I don't have time right now. Take my social and political philosophy course. Here's what we need to recognize is that much more than science is going on. For as important as the science is, it has to get enrolled into the broader picture of the human political condition. We are what Aristotle called the zoon politikon, that is the political animal. So we have our family associations in the home, the oikos. We have, in addition to those, this bios politikos, this public life, this political life that is intrinsic to the human condition. So above and beyond family life, we're political creatures. And no, it's not that we're social creatures, because yeah, ants are social creatures and other animals gather together in groups, right, even beyond the family unit. But for humans, this gathering, this political realm, is one of speech and deeds. It's one where we use words and action, and we use words and action to try to persuade people to do certain things. Violence is, of course, often used, but it is a mute and apolitical blunt force that could be just as true of any social creature using violence and intimidation. The political realm is the realm of speaking, understanding, communicating, and acting, right? I put this one in bold because maybe this is the most important one, plurality. And I'm going to actually put the next one up to uniqueness, right? So every individual is unique. We're not cogs, we're not clones, we're not predetermined. The political realm is the realm of freedom, where we get to express who we are, who I am. There's a space of appearance, and it's plurality because nobody lives on an island. We live in a world that testifies to the presence of other people, and in which we appear as who we are, and we enact our stories, right? All of these are foundational things. That's what I'm getting at, that we have to call to mind now when we start theorizing climate science in context. This is the context, right? It's the human condition is one of power too. Power isn't something you store up. It's this in-between activity. So power happens when there's inequalities, right? Ups and downs, marginal and center, something to pay attention to. It's deeply connected with justice, obviously, which can be in terms of recognizing somebody, giving them a voice, a place, distributing resources, or retribution in terms of what do we do to try to amend past wrongs, which I think is a really interesting one with climate. When you look at past emissions from industrialized nations, do they have some future obligations on the basis of those past emissions, even though the current citizens of those nations weren't around in the past to make those emissions, right? Big one, sovereignty and jurisdiction. The political realm, such as we experience it now, is not a collection of random individuals. It is a collection of nation states, each claiming their sovereignty. Multinational corporations that are trying to interlace across those sovereign zones. And then within each nation state, you have subnational actors, states, counties, cities, organizations. Who has what power? So quid jure, who has the power to make what decisions? And then conditioning all of this is our collective history. I just mentioned a few things: colonialism, globalization, technoscience, and development, the UN development goals. These condition everything. Finally, this is the human condition. And Arendt was talking about humans in these political groups, but maybe climate change should get us thinking about a post-human politics. Maybe the earth and her creatures and her ecosystems like rivers should be taken into account as members of the political community. Maybe rivers should, for example, have rights. And this is the way to address climate change. So that's big, big picture stuff, right? All of this is to just keep in your mind as we try to theorize these science-politics relationships. Now, stepwise, let's come down a step from 30,000 feet to like the 3,000 foot level of mapping the social process, which is something we've looked at a couple of times. This is just, we've already, in a way, all those big questions I just talked about, we've already mentioned, right? It's all built into this little simple map of any climate policy context. Here it is. Within the participants, you have questions about power and equality and freedom and the perspectives you have, their values. And this is all about plurality, right? Because guess what? People disagree. What do we do about that? How do we handle it? The situation, the historical, ecological situations that we're in, right? The strategies that people use, all of these boxes have these perennial political questions about power, justice, freedom, human plurality and uniqueness, jurisdictional battles, right? It's built into this. So big things to keep in mind as we map this space. Now, the other book I mentioned is by a guy named Albert Borgmann, who was a philosopher. By the way, both Borgmann and Arendt, scholars of Martin Heidegger, students of Heidegger. Something to get in perhaps later on that if philosophers among you are interested. Borgmann has just a nice way of reminding us what science can and cannot do. Modern natural science, that is. It can explain how things work. And it can set the standards for explanation such that we can say, look, if that's not a scientific explanation, it doesn't have any status in terms of helping us decide what to do. So it can become the standard bearer for explanations. It can correct pre-scientific views. So we used to think Halley's Comet was a bad omen from the gods, but now we know it's this orbiting ball of rock and ice, right? And it can give us a very coherent and detailed view of the world from the macro level to the micro level. You can take any object and go from quarks and atoms on up through molecules and up the level, the chain of being, right? And it's a coherent and very detailed view of reality. And particularly important for climate change is it can disclose new or invisible phenomena. We've talked about how the climate and climate change don't register directly on the human sensorium. You need the mediation of science to even have this be part of your reality, right? So that was part of the essential role of science. But science doesn't do it all, right? We're not computers. We are the zoon political. We're political animals. So we need what Borgmann calls world articulation. That is, where in modern science are we going to find significance and meaning? You know, in this chain from atoms on up to the universe. Where is our place, right? What's our story? How do I develop a worldview where I get my bearings? That's not in the science, right? Another way to put this is climate science only matters if we make it matter. If it becomes a concern to us, right? If it becomes a part of our story. And for that to happen, we need to draw on different sources other than science. It needs to become part of our story. How do we do that? That's, I think, a really important question. Science has a very hard time making qualitative distinctions about better and worse. And I think because we are such a techno-scientific culture, we latch on to easy to measure metrics of progress like GDP, gross domestic product. Like if we're making more money, that's better. More is better. That's not always the case. So science can't help us articulate qualitative differences and make judgments of quality for us. Problem formulation. We can do all the science in the world, but it's really not a scientific question to say, where should we point our scientific inquiry, right? So what's relevant? What should we know? Where should we spend our time and our money and focus our attention? How do we prioritize different problems and frame and weigh competing values? How do we distribute power? How do we frame what's possible to do and what we're going to consider beyond the realm of possibility? These are in themselves not scientific questions, but they're absolutely vital to climate politics. And action, ultimately. Science discloses the world to us as something that we can modify, but it doesn't tell us whether to modify it, which parts to modify, how much, in what ways, what to leave alone. These are all political, values-based questions that are interwoven in the science, right? I put here solar radiation management from geoengineering. Should we put sulfates in the upper stratosphere? That is not a scientific question, even though it has all of these techno-scientific dimensions to it, right? So yeah, march for science. But which science and where are we marching, you know? And yes, science is real in the sense that you can't just, if you're a political leader, you can't just make things up without having the scientific evidence to back up your claim. Yes, but science is not our primary or our most intuitive access to reality, right? So how do we make science real for us? These are political questions. And I think it's why we need to be climate philosophers. So all of this is just to say, look, climate change is as much a human science or a humanities realm of study as it is in natural science. So we have to follow these rhizomes. Remember mode 2 inquiry? All of these cross-cutting questions between this human and the natural world, the political and the scientific worlds, they're all tangled together. And so module 3 is just developing more tools to do that. So I'll wrap up just by mentioning, isn't this cute? Look, module 3 with the E for the 3. That was Akbar's idea. He's such a wordsmith. Here's what's coming up. These are the lectures in the module ahead of us. We're going to look at 3 theories of climate science politics. One of them, as in, is the linear model that, hey, if you just do the science, the political decisions will kind of automatically fall out the back end. The next, what we'll talk about as paradox, this excess of objectivity, that actually it's not that simple, right? And then the third is propaganda. I don't know if that's maybe not quite the right word, but the idea that maybe there are nefarious forces at work. Then we just have one lecture devoted to the media. Again, I think it's so important. And so the media is kind of shot throughout all of these lectures, but we'll just focus on it for one. And then again, this all comes together in stories, narratives, meaning making. So we'll look at a couple of the big narratives out there. Note, I'm not going to spend time on a third narrative, which is that climate change is a hoax or something. It's not a legitimate narrative. We can talk about that later. And then I thought, you know what? Okay, capitalism in economics is like the media, shot throughout a lot of the stuff we're talking about. But let's take at least one lecture and really foreground that and talk about that explicitly. Is capitalism the problem or the solution or both? Right? Okay, so that's a look ahead. Akbar, you know, our space hero, channeling the spirit of Hannah Arendt, says our capacity for excellence in speech and deeds makes us all humanoids. Akbar, poet and space hero. Okay, and now, until next time, may the force be with you.